Hello world, Clinton here to talk about the reinventio of art, which is a discussion just uploaded today on the internet by John Vervaeke in his Voices with Vervaeke series, which he had with Andrew Sweeney and Chris Maestro-Petro. Now, Professor John Vervaeke, cognitive scientist from University of Toronto, I like his videos because they absolutely drive me up the wall, and I end up getting so overloaded with responses and rebuttals to every single sentence that I turn them off after 5 minutes in frustration and pace around the house for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, working through, stuff which I have instead decided today to encapsulate and write down completely. So we're going to go through this video basically line by line. It took me about 6 hours to get halfway through. I think it's a good start. Well, I still got it in me here. It's interesting to see how this ground about art, which is what this video is about, be retread by people, 70, 80, 90 years after this ground was being originally tread, historically speaking. So we're going to go see how this video that they had was a recapitulation of what was new and what was contemporarily understood as art 100 years ago, at least, which Marshall McLuhan spent most of his life trying to recapitulate to people who missed it all the first time. We'll see how more about that later. Let's dive into the conversation. So it's between three very intelligent gentlemen. The topic of the video, as Andrew Sweeney suggests, is how do we reinvent art? John Vervaeke says, what is the role of art in dialogos and dialectic? Now, logos is, of course, what McLuhan's master's or doctorate. He got his English doctorate. His thesis was on precisely the historical anatomy of the logos for like 2,000 years, 2,300 years from all of like history from Socrates straight through Western history, I should say, straight through Roman antiquity and the medieval trivium and Neoplatonism and St. Thomas and all the way up to the Renaissance, and right. So the logos is well established already. The first thing he did before he even became a media scholar. So that's why I am That is why I'm taking the perspective on this conversation that I am by shoehorning myself in with this video. So, as John Vervaeke begins, art gets us to remember the non-categorical nature of things. Good. Art plays with and through our salience landscaping, which is to say, it massages our sensibility and affects our capacity for perception, hones our perceptive faculties. It does and should take us to that liminal space where we are trying to improve our capacity for discernment. Yes, very good. Talks about some guy named Fisher who says that art puts us on the horizon of intelligibility, which precisely, as far as I can tell, correlates to the vanishing point of a perspective painting. It's exactly what it is, actually, insofar as people with a perspective or a private point of view put things in logical perspective and then go through the vanishing point. Like a cowboy riding into the sunset, into Wonderland down the rabbit hole, in art. Art versus bullshit. And bullshit things are salient beyond our understanding. Art is the same at first. It's like bullshit. It's triggering inchoate feelings and conceptions. Andrew says, art gets us in touch with what we don't quite already know. Very nice. Art is ascending, trying to point us into space beyond where we are. Yes, it is. But that's more generalizable than we think, which actually Andrew brings up much later in the video. With art, you're encountering a state of wonder. Opening up, trying to recover a deeper state of truth or realness. Okay, the first footnote down below in the just above the comments section, you'll find a link to McLuhan's essay Nihilism Exposed, which is all about exactly the topic of conversation through the lens of a review of Hugh Kenner's book on Wyndham Lewis, who was one of the great men of 1914, who were the artists who figured out all of this stuff and who McLuhan spent the rest of his life trying to recapitulate their perceptions in his contemporary day with the dawn of television. The other three, by the way, are T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and James Joyce. Yeah, James Joyce. James Joyce was a bit of an artist, as we'll revisit. The point is, everything these guys are talking about was already said by them in terms which flesh it out a lot better. That's what I'm going to try to touch base here. So, yeah, you'll get this when you read Nihilism is Art. Andrew makes a distinction between art and mindless entertainment, which is 90% bullshit, and Vervaeke agrees. Okay, no, see. The most common things around us are art, which need the most scrutiny because we don't think of them as art. Advertisements, basic television commercial advertisements are art. McLuhan's got an article in the CBC Bulletin in the 50s called Baseball is Art, trying to make this point. I mean, his first book, Mechanical Bride, was entirely trying to analyze the most mundane garbage as art. And then, just for effect, he did it again with the man in the Hathaway shirt, who we first discussed in Catholic Humanism and Modern Letters, which is also extremely relevant to what we'll be talking about. The point is, everything is art. Absolutely everything, especially the most mundane stuff that there is. Case in point, comic books or kiddie stories on television, all the most penny, dirt cheap pulp fiction stuff is art. And I don't mean Pulp Fiction the movie, I mean actual pulp paper cheap advertisement. See, here we got this young gentleman, Stan Lee, being noticed by McLuhan in 1952 as being directly on the pulse of culture, and of course all of Stan Lee's stuff subsequent to this book exploded all over the planet and has basically become the secular Campbellian monomyth of entire Western cinematic age right now. So, yeah, that's all. It's not mindless entertainment at all. The so-called mindless entertainment is actually the most absolute effective art that we have right now. You gotta flip that all around. John says, if we make the distinction... Okay, I'm going to start switching back to the view where you can see what I'm holding up. I've got to remember to do that. All right. John says, if we make the distinction, then romantics won't like this. But art is educational. Yes, exactly. Especially lowbrow art. And it is supposed to help us discern between bullshit and wonder. I think there's a better distinction to be made, and it's the distinction between A, the fetishization of either ADHD sensuousness or abstract, let's say autistic logical coherency on one side, right? That's whole spectrum of the mind-body split, the disassociation of sensibility, the gap between procedural and propositional knowing on one hand, and the experience of participational and perspectival and the more embodied forms of knowing on the other hand, right? So that split is A. So there's a difference between that and B, the stabilization of time and space as complementary to human embodied being now and here, while maintaining suspended judgment upon all that one will never live long enough to know and learn. Return to the human scale, in other words. So what's wrong is, we're lost in time and space and meaning, and superheroes have come to feast on our flesh not yet deceased, for instance. You might want to put it that way. All art, especially entertainment, yes. So the conversation continues. John is still saying, we have to open our salience landscape. Our salience landscape is restructured in the service of the pursuit of truth and a deeper connection, instead of misdirection or escape or entertainment, where we cut ourselves off from reality for a while. All right, see, ideally where art places you, if it actually does its job as you want it to do, is to make escapism for you impossible, because you are fully indwelling and embodied in reality all the time. You want to be constantly feeling reality, and thus the possibility to lose yourself and escape for a little while is forestalled. It's cut out. That was a childish thing that you grew out of when you went through the vanishing point, or through whatever transformative experience you're trying to concoct here that brings people into connection with reality. And of course, what's reality is that now you're sitting in a darkened movie theater surrounded by people who are mostly all zonked out living in the fantasy while you're sitting there looking at them. You're looking at these bunch of actors and cheesy special effects going through this ritualized story, which is totally formulaic, right? You can't escape into the fantasy, at least not completely, because you're always there in the theater, right? You kill the ability for the art to take you in and remove you from the here and now. Yeah, I think that's what I say here. And the problem with that is, of course, you become megalomaniacal in comparison to all the people around you who are still lost in time and space or the content or captivated by a film. So, film being our example, it's easier to say film than to talk about cyberspace or simulation quite yet. But let's use film as an example. John says, I'm not against entertainment. I'm opposed to entertainment as a way of life. Okay, well, I mean, sitting around watching true crime dramas about horrible, murders that happened and listening to police recount testimonies of finding the body and stuff. There's lots of that stuff. Is that entertainment? It is, but it also embraces what you're talking about with in terms of like horror coming up. Right. So, I mean, you can perform encounters with reality, which are still entirely dreamlike and unreal. If they don't take place in reality, they're not real. Even if it's, this isn't entertaining. This is very serious, performative, torturing myself for some, reason or another. Chris says, in the opening up, art helps transcribe the logos of an encounter into mythos. Yeah. The way these terms are being used by these gentlemen so far, yeah, that's right. It's the dispersal of an experience into a landscape that can then be regathered and retrieved. Cool media, the technique of the French symbolists of the mid-1800s who were reacting to their environment, as informed by Edgar Allan Poe, which we'll find out real soon. So yeah, this idea of scattering stuff and then having to go around and put it together, this is what's called discontinuous structuring. In the literary studies that McLuhan, again, writes books and books and books and books and books about. This is his whole job. His entire career is trying to explain to people the nature of discontinuous forms of people piecing together, being hunters in their environment, piecing the story together, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, exactly. This is art, but it's true of all media, not just art. It's actually true of the modern experience today as it's structured by our encounter with reality, as we'll again see. Narrative is the canonical form of art, as a thing which telescopes the logos. Yes, but again, it's because of the printing press. Literally, as soon as books flooded on the scene 500 years ago, that's when that became canonical. Literally, like the novel is only like a couple hundred years old and it's already dead. That's a long form of narrative. Right now, we got like prestige television. Like narrative is an effect of our media. Chris says art has a parabolic function, as Socrates blows himself up to city level, and then people bring it back down again to the personal level, up and down. Right? Yeah. You see, I'm complaining here that they're glossing over stuff that's far more finely articulated in all the art magazines that I've been studying McLuhan. Like I'm reading copies of Transitions magazine from coming out of Paris in the 20s and 30s, oh heck, you've got there's the commie ones, of course. There's the Partisan Review. Must have read 100 articles, like art analysis articles from the Partisan Review, trying to understand what artists thought art was 100 years ago when they were like looking at these artists. What was the intellectual milieu of McLuhan? And yeah, they already went over that. Like this is all well trodden ground. All this stuff that I'm talking about so far, which is good. It's good these guys are like catching up to the historical sense of what art was articulated as 100 years ago. That's essential to understand. I can point out lots of great places to go study more about this stuff directly because I've been swimming in it for the past 4 years. Literary studies are necessary to classify and identify the approaches our individual artists take. How these generalizations are valid but contrasting and not contiguous. For example, the approach of exploring the truth when the honest piece back together relies on the inductive method of storytelling as told backwards as innovated by Edgar Allan Poe. Yeah, guess what? Edgar Allan Poe invented the detective novel. The art aesthete Dupin, who goes around and, can just see the scattered clues and in his head backwards forms, comes up with the solves the crime, right? Which is like the most popular form of fiction that we have actually right now. Anyway, it's funny because I paused that and then there was a great synchronicity where the second I unpaused it to write this note, Andrew Sweeney mentioned Edgar Allan Poe. And that stuff drives me crazy because I just hate it when computers preempt me and try to make it seem like it's reading my mind or some shit. Or just more likely some AI crap, right? Like, this is the shit that's driving people crazy. That's the more contemporary environment that actually people are trying to swim in. The artists got nothing to do with what's going on 100 years ago. But you got to get through it to get to where we're at now. So, Andrew is mentioning Socrates' censorious statements on art, and echoes his warning that it could lead toward moral ends, such as defining good and evil. John agrees. John reiterates his intention, which is not to advocate for moralism in art, is to explore how art relates to dialectic. His particular, by dialectic he means like conversation, basically. That's what it means in this context. In a way analogous to how philosophy plays with concepts, art plays with our sensorium. $1 million word, great word. I didn't notice when John Vervaeke started throwing around the word sensorium, but A+, right on. Our salience landscaping. He says, Poe's shock horror is to startle us and wake us up to really there, beneath the veneer of civilized existence. Horror, awe, and wonder exist on a spectrum. Now, this is something he did elaborate in his Meaning Crisis series. I like it, but also sensation, the feeling of sensation, the shocking into of awareness is like the junk food, fast food element, right, of art. It's a tool which is entirely overblown or overused and becomes the ends in and of itself. People use art in order to, right, that is why the escapism happens, because they can trust art to shock them into a different place for a little while and not to shock them into some semblance of reality. Yeah, art can't be too concrete, exactly. Exercises our cognitive faculties need to be addressed and educated, independent of our capacity for reflective conceptualization. Yeah, yes. Let's move on. John's art training gave him discernment for arts, lets him tell real art from propaganda. The former being some sort of simulacrum to Andrew. Propaganda encloses you within an ideological framework. See, again, you can read about that 100 years ago when it was becoming very obvious that, I guess propaganda was kind of a big thing 100 years ago. I'll start with that. Again, Wyndham Lewis goes into all of this exhaustively and extensively. This particularly in the diabolical principle, where he's looking at these editors at the Transition magazine coming out of Paris to America in the 1920s. They're using art and art criticism as a means to push their radical ideology, which Lewis stands counter to at this time in the 20s, much to his later misfortune. You see, the point there, though, is that the propaganda is art. It's extremely powerful art. That's what makes it work. And furthermore, it's operating within the context of the total environment, which itself is no longer real enough to hold people insofar as what it as a total environment, how that is exercising faculties apart from people's capacity for reflective conceptualization. See, this is actually the gap between propositional knowing and the other more embodied forms of knowing. Is art which treats these things as separate. And of course, the invention of the telegraph in the mid 1800s is the real cause of all of this, which I never would expect these guys to, bring up now. But spoiler alert, that's where it all comes from. Chris Masterpietro says, art takes the closed ends of the world and reopens them, reopening the world. To take the such of an encounter and use it as a way of presencing the want for more, hence the apparent and implicit eros of art, aware of its own finitude and limitations, and constantly ascends beyond itself from the species of a particular thing to the more of whatever the elusive parent of that species is. The more elusive parent of that species, which it is trying to retrieve. Yeah, okay, so that's the little epic, the Apuleian. It's the model Joyce employs in Ulysses, although it's also employed often by the poet Tennyson. You can read all about this in the Interior Landscape. Oh yeah, there you go. There's another word for interiority for you. You got, let's see here. Oh yeah, I said I was going to do this. All right, the Interior Landscape. Exactly what Chris just said. Very well established form over literary history. Again, Tennyson and Keats specifically. I'm gonna link an essay down below by Andrew Crystal going into more of this. You can also read a lot about this in From Cliché to Archetype, that little yellow book I got up there. So yeah, now again, this is still art content. This is still like book world, typographical world, in the way that it begins to become this multi-leveled thing, which tends to have all like present itself as this sort of like Gnostic hallucination. So anyways, it's trying to draw the affinity between these two things and continue to try and do the impossible, close what is inexhaustible, to attempt to close the suchness of specificity and the moreness of what's unbounded. Yes, this is the cool approach to media, McLuhan would later say. Anyway, yeah, as I said, this peaked 100 years ago. Well, a little less than 100 years ago. Now all art is content. And the real art is the actual programmable physical environment of our entirely manufactured artifice world, and my own embodied relation to it as it tries to capture me within its simulation of the total world as fever dream. See, McLuhan died in 1980, and then we've had 40 years of a microcomputer and simulations, and so everything's so much further ahead than even he was ahead 40 years ago, and he was so much further ahead than where this conversation is at now. This conversation right now is contemporary to what artists were talking about in the 1910s, 1920s, and spelling out in literary journals and criticisms in the 1930s and such. So again, we got to introduce. Here we go. We got to introduce the temporal. Like, where is this conversation even taking place, and to what environment and to what culture is it relevant? Let's not look at a dichotomy between art as having a lofty, highbrow function on one hand, and entertainment and propaganda on the other hand. Instead, let's look at the total environment today as being art. All art content, which, again, actually, Andrew makes very clear later on in the video, we'll get there soon, that he doesn't want to look at art as just like the plastic arts or like a song that some guy wrote. But he wants art as a form of being. Well, let's just completely invert it. The environment itself is art, and then we be in relation to it, right? As people who perceive it as still time and space, for having gone down to the bottom of it by being media aware. Art as content is nostalgia. It's the cause of neoteny. It's the cause of neoteny. It's basically the 100 years ago, you could go see a film, you could put on a song on your radio or a news broadcast that was full of propaganda, I suppose, or read a book. And so there was art, and art was a thing that was a content in the thing. But at that time, we were getting to the point where the total actual environment, owing to marketers and advertisements and governments and propagandists and manipulators and all that stuff, itself became all of it is art. Everything in my room is art, right? And humans reached a level where our perception of the total environment as art was the state of high art, or right? That's where art got to. And ever since then, we've been living in total worlds which are artifice, which if maybe that'll help McLuhan make more sense if he doesn't make sense to you, because the Sputnik itself is the proscenium arch of the global theater, because the whole world is literally now a stupid soundstage. That's where art got to way back then, and so that's what art is and has been for way too long. So if you're talking about art content, that's a nostalgic view of art. If you pretend art is a film or movie or painting or book or play or poem or fashion statement, right? All those things are art within art. Reality itself is now the art. Because everyone's living in the nostalgic view where they still think art is the commodity, right? Chris, Andrew, and John are hastily and sloppily recapitulating confused arguments which have been made before McLuhan and recapitulated in pacing detail subtly by him over his whole life in oeuvre. Yes, you have to get through this. It's all important that we understand what they're saying, but also just understand and place it in its proper historical context within at least the Western tradition of art, which is implicitly the ground for what we're getting at here. Art today is magic. Like Arthur C. Clarke, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Yes, well, nobody knows how technology works. They just walk around in the magical, enchanted world, and magic stuff happens if they throw money in a certain direction. They can just pay for stuff to happen, right? And they don't know how it happens. That's the job for experts and hackers and nerds and the people they pay to make stuff happen for them. But the environment is totally, literally enchanted, magical for most people whose interface with it is throwing money at it. That is what is afforded to them, literally, like pocketbook afforded. I get it. So this happens when physical time and space becomes the content of art. Like multimedia, electricity, and cinema, and television especially, and now simulation, computer simulation, cyberspace, has for its content our actual lived reality, and we live in it. Look at augmented reality today. It just makes it all the more freaking explicit how much more... Then again, it was all extremely explicit back in, 1992 when Doug Rushkoff was writing Siberia, right? Like, this book is way ahead in its conception of what art is than where most people are talking about today. Even Doug Rushkoff was more present in today when he wrote this book in 1992 than he is being lately, because of course everyone's kind of distracted lately by contemporary events. The point is, that's where we're at, people. So, we got the Tolstoy story, of course, this technique again, the French symbolists like Mallarmé and Baudelaire got the technique from Edgar Allan Poe for symbolism. John calls it a cognitive evolution. We're evolving our capacity for sensory motor interaction with the world. That's so Bergsonian. Again, Bergson was he's another guy who's way late to the game in articulating what the French symbolists were saying decades beforehand. Again, another example, black boxes, Sherry Turkle's entire career, right? Simulation is discontents, the second self, right? The divine double, or the digital twin, or, we'll get more to Lewis in a second here. Andrew relates through his songwriting when he was younger. The more he didn't know what he was doing, the more he was in an area that he was alive. I totally relate 100%. His lyrics are entirely non-propositional. It sounds like romanticism. This is exactly how I made my own music and how I made Silicon and Charybdis. I was literally flying on the wings of inspiration that I could not understand, which was like my brain was self-organizing far faster than I could consciously rationalize it, and so I was just living. Luckily, I'd read Otto Rank's Art and Artist. I think I got that somewhere actually. I don't know where my copy of Art and Artist is. Anyway, that's of course the book that's behind The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker. Anyway, So, point is, as you learned what you're doing came harder to do. To construct art is hard because it relies on something from beyond, like inspiration. Yes. John says we don't do an insight, but we do things which trigger the process of insight to self-organize, and then we bear witness to epiphanies. And then if you're an artist with talent, as Ernest Becker was renowned for saying, if you actually have talent, you don't just bear witness to that epiphany and drive yourself neurotic, you actually give birth to art, which then shares in a generalizable sense for everyone else. And of course, now what there is to bear epiphany to is the very nature of reality itself. Reality itself is the art, and then what you have to make is a total environment, not just content of a movie or a painting or a song, right? That's not the art anymore. The art is going around shaping worlds, which, look at Dungeons and Dragons, for instance. World building. That's been the art for what, like, how long have people been doing that now? Like, 30 years. Yeah. World building. Yeah. Augmented reality. Yeah. Great. Modern politics is going to be so freaking great, eh? So, back to Andrew. So, most of the work is not it's not artistic expression. It's training and opening yourself up for some kind of spirit or muse to arrive at your doorstep. Yes. And also, that's absolutely a terribly dangerous condition to be in, and absolutely no warning was even suggested in this video that that is extremely dangerous, because when you open yourself up in that regard, but you aren't actually grounded in the present in time and space, if you aren't working to ground yourself in the present of time and space by being aware of what modern media is and what the present content of the present state of the art is, which is computers, and how everything that most people are looking at is the content of computers and not looking at the medium themselves, you're opening yourself up to literal possession of yourself by a digital twin doppelganger conception, narcissistic mirror reflection within the simulation. You literally become taken over by your social media image of you in plain terms, and that contemporary you can understand today. But that's been true for like an artist who's more powerful than you will steal your soul if you open yourself up that way naively. Full stop. Okay? This is literally magic shit. Okay? John says he's trying. Don't believe me? Go read the friggin' art. Anyway. The art journals of back when, from where McLuhan's getting all this stuff. John says he's trying to get away from the product of art onto the process of art. What has to happen? Well, you have to master the medium, which today is reality itself and its very similar simulation within cyberspace and the invisible black box of computers, which are an extension of our capacity for propositional logic. And by master, I mean feel them. Steve Jobs was an artist. Okay, guys, yep, exactly. Here's the simplest way I can put it. Steve Jobs, we're still living in the content of Steve Jobs' artwork, right? But Gary Kildall was an artist, and you don't even know who the hell Gary Kildall was. Richard Stallman's an artist, and he doesn't know, and you also don't know who the hell Richard Stallman is. They are more powerful, bigger artists in the medium Steve Jobs was an artist in than Steve Jobs, but their history is literally erased because you don't know the history of what our environment is made out of, so you don't know where you are in time and space because you don't know what you're looking at because you're surrounded by black boxes. We are affording you interfaces into a combinatorially explosive dream called cyberspace of infinite, limitless content of old art, like TV shows and movies, the old discrete art, which John is trying to say. You know, the products of art, the commoditized art pieces of yesterday, are now in this cyberspace that everyone is getting sucked into because they don't know what reality is made of, and computers are too hard. I just want to buy it and make it easy to use, man. Which is why everyone needs to go study Gary Kildall and Richard Stallman. Ahem. Andrew points to the artist can get trapped by their own art. Yes, and as Chris points out, they're stuck in the having mode. They get trapped in identity. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That's very true. You get known for a thing, you just do that thing all day, Yeah. John says dialogos. There's a transfer relationship between this training and discernment so we can reliably discriminate between bullshit and wonder. Again, I would suggest the dichotomy of the old thing as content of the new, the old thing as being salient, and striving to see what the new thing is that is actually happening, where that old thing is, right? You got to introduce the temporal. Like, you got to reground yourself in time and space and leave the past and get into the present. Bullshit, wonder, that's all like different flavors of past. Get to the present. So anyways, he says that you find a place within dialectic as a practice and dialogos as a process. Dialogos is committed to emergence. Yeah, see, a big reason that this book is so great is because Rushkoff gets well into general systems theories and, like the Santa Fe dudes, emergence, the idea of complexity arriving from enough interacting parts and parts being, right, that awful, well, it's not, yeah, it's awful, that awful language which is totally taken over everything, and computer AI guys love to use to frame stuff too, and then they can't escape their own frame. That was huge with like fractals and stuff in the 80s. Yeah. It's no good for actually perceiving a reality. It's totally a way to trap yourself entirely within a simulation. But great. If that whatever helps you think about stuff, you got to use the tools you got, and if emergence is in your vocabulary, you can use it till you finally lose it, please. So Dialogos is committed to taking us through the horizon of intelligibility. Again, the horizon of intelligibility, aka taking us through the vanishing point. Ooh, yes. Sorry, that's just corny. Getting us to see things in their non-categorical identity. Yes, because categories are a linear, are something that became hypertrophied. The categorization of everything became hypertrophied with the invention of the printing press. But became big through Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and we're all talking about ontology and stuff because of the phonetic alphabet. Again, I don't need to tell you. All the work's already been done. Andrew says people have a limited conception of what art is. Limited to performance or plastic arts. Fundamentally, your whole life should be art. Maybe that's a grandiose statement. I want there to be a larger definition of art. Yes, there should be. Wonderful. Excellent insight. Lifestyle. Yes, very much so. Again, Adam Curtis's Century of the Self. I'm going to link it down below. Just one example of how, yes, we're way ahead of where this conversation is at, and you guys already know about this, and I know I feel like I'm a condescending asshole on one hand, but also, like, this is how I feel watching these videos as an autodidact. A dangerous autodidact. It's interesting how industrial designers were stealing Gibson's term affordance in the 80s as just one more layer of illusion that now has to be seen through. Anyway, yeah, the degradation of lifestyle. Yeah, Andrew, this idea of art as something more. Yeah, it totally is. It's literally occult magic, okay? Andrew posits maybe Nietzsche was too individualistic. Solo artists, not in a band. John, yeah, he lost the Apollonian and Dionysian balance within art, which is Camille Paglia reference. That's pretty great. Chris recapitulates. Yes, okay, so Chris recapitulates an earlier discussion about the choral elements of dialogue. I was getting back to Andrew's point here, and dialectic is foundational to its place. Wyndham Lewis, the dithyrambic spectator. It's what it's about. It's about the transformation of McLuhan's apocryphal Balinesian tribesman who says, "We have no art. We do everything as well as possible," which McLuhan cribbed. It's a bad paraphrase of McLuhan from a story told by Krishnamurti in The Bugbear of Literacy. So you got these like primitive peoples literally living their life. And then it becomes ritualized, and it becomes like a show. It starts happening with a chorus. It becomes more ritual and formalized, and then eventually people watch, and it's like the invention of theater. This is just the myth. It's not exactly historical true, but this is how Lewis gets about informing the reader about how the people watching a ritual, the seats, end up giving their name to the building that we call a theater. Right? The audience is more important in defining what's happening in a theater than what was initially important, which was the actual ritual being performed. Right? The act of sitting there and silently watching and seeing the total environment in which all the village people are dancing. creates this divorce of spectator from real life, and in the spectator's mind now enables them to sort of take over the total environment as someone creating, say, scripts, plays, right? This is, the cool, collected, detached watcher can diabolically possess souls, because the first part of the book, The Dithyrambic Spectator, is the diabolical principle. Great book. It's like 1928 or something. Anyway, John agrees through reiteration that art isn't romantic self-expression, but self-cultivation. Yes, and making a new way of being for use and others. Yes, good, invert it. Art is making a new environment within which people gracefully degrade or are ripped apart and then are caught and built up again as they find out where they are now. This is McLuhan's term, anti-environment. The job of an artist is to show us what our world is made of by creating anti-environments, which let people now recognize for the first time the environment they had been living in all along, but which had been insalient to them, rendering to people what was never salient to them because owing its utter ubiquity. Opening up another world. Exactly. It's all McLuhan prescribes. Andrew talks about Paggio and movement through icons, and he wants. This is actually important. Like, he implies, the movement to selfhood, implicitly with Descartes and Newton through to Einstein. This is exactly what Wyndham Lewis's Time in Western Man is about. I got a link below. We got someone fast up on the trail on this, a new YouTuber who's already jumping on this totally unclaimed territory by reading from Time in Western Man, which no one else is doing on YouTube. Through to postmodernism, and now the self is dissolved. He wants a post-traditional art. It's here. It's all in McLuhan already, okay? John says modern art reminds him of the non-narrative wonder, liberates from the egoic by going across narratives. Kandinsky. Okay. See, those are not useful explanations of modern art. Modern art is what happens when you invent the telegraph, and Newtonian space is imploded by cause and effect suddenly becoming instantaneous across the entire planet, and the entire planet suddenly becoming a one singular zone for real-time interaction, and everyone gets their newspaper in like the year 1870, 1880, and they open up their newspaper, and the entire world is splayed at their fingertips every day in near real time, refreshed every single day with every morning newspaper, using the telegraph from across the planet. That's a couple decades of that melts people's brains. All the smartest people go crazy trying to make sense of the world, and then they create modern art. Okay, that's modern art. Multi-perspectival, all this stuff. All right. John says approaching the sacred in art. This is all very good. The stuff on parables was great. Narratives that deconstruct themselves and self falls apart, trying to get into them. They explode you beyond the egocentric way of being. Yes. Again, James Joyce. John prescribes the creation of not of art trophies or commodities, I'll say, but art parables, which constantly propel us beyond ourselves. Yes, very important. Rocky Horror Show. Chris notes the pejorative way which Andrew and John discuss art as self-expression and posits the reclaiming the notion that art as selves-expression. Right? It's like add an S to the self, right? It becomes selves-expression, inclusive of the divine double, making it also self-impression from something larger, which is not eminently retrievable. Yes, this is where Otto Rank in Art and Artist is talking about how the artist completes, right? He's trying to whom do we attribute a piece of art? The individual artist or the whole total culture within, right? When we say that this piece of art represents this culture at this time, representative of this culture, how can we say it represents the culture when it's clearly just one artisan who made it? And of course, it's because the artist is someone who, in completing a hole or running into a gap in their own perception, running into a total gap of unawareness, right? That their culture never prepared them for, and they plunge into that abyss of that gap and try to feel out what's really going on and change their perception, and then they create art which in themselves fills that gap for themselves. They also simultaneously filling that gap for everyone else, right? It's like that until that art was born, the fruit of the artistic creative labor, the culture implied the coming to be of that art by having a lack of any awareness of this area. uh, the very ignorance of the culture compelled the artist to bring that art into fruition so as to fill in this gap in the larger perceptual reality, which kind of also brings back to the whole choral element that was going on before. Let's see here. By trying to ontologically conform with that which is not eminently retrievable, it becomes a way of rendering the self yet undiscovered. Yes. One attempts the self out of reach to bring it into presence. Yeah, I'd say one. It's like you imagine a self who you want to be, one dimension, one facet of a self that you want to be, and so you try to perform that, and capture it in art. And if you fake it and you make it in that abstract, uncertain, tentative, dreamlike way, then once you've made the art, you can look back on it in retrospect, and all the other facets which are part of that mode of being sort of become obvious. All that you can't say in the art and that you leave to be suggested, all the discontinuities, all the gaps in the art that you create, all the other facets that would be necessary for living that mode of being, you can come up with later, after you've made the artwork. It's exactly how I made my prelude to Silicon and Charybdis like 2 years ago. Just me sitting there telling a story into a camera, and I was terrified, and I didn't even know what I was doing, but I was like, well, I'm just this confident guy telling this story that's totally true, and I totally see that this makes sense. When in fact, that it's something that I had very tenuously pieced together and was just very fresh, and right, but since then, now it's like all these other facets which are left unsaid in the video make it seem like I was saying that all along, when really I was just, waiting to be filled in, right? So yes, it's an extremely astute observation, formulation by Chris. Andrew calls it art as a gesture towards something which cannot be told explicitly. Hence, says Chris, it must be translucent and porous, i.e. full of gaps or discontinuous. Cool media, cool media. Resonance, a quadpartite metaphor instead of tripartite dialectic. Within McLuhan's usage of the term dialectic, which differs from just bull session form. It's kind of funny how the word bullshit has one meaning, but for McLuhan, a bull session or bullshitting session means what for Vervaeke means by dialectic. And then by dialectic, when McLuhan says dialectic, he's saying propositional knowing, which is a very confined definition compared to how it's just funny how words, all these equivocations, so many equivocations. So, magical realism as a genre of narrative is parabolic. Yeah, if you don't understand computers, then it seems like the world is full of magic, and then Harry Potter and fantasy and Lord of the Rings and all this fine art actually does represent the day-to-day lived experience of people. They never know what crazy thing is going to be invented next when they're actually just living in a totally simulated environment constructed by what they trust statisticians to have measured, and computers to have quantified, and sociologists to have analyzed, and then activists to have operationalized into countervailing zeitgeists, and we all just have to think and believe this way, and we'll counteract, right? Living within this highly enchanted story mode of media content, media narratives. All right, there's a reason that today everyone's talking about getting red-pilled or getting woke from the mainstream narrative, and it's because they all live in the content and they're not paying attention to the media themselves. So yeah, and that's in that mindset. Sure, magical realism feels like actual reality, and fake realism, like actual realism, feels fake. When people try to write reality, it feels fake, because actual reality is a weird science fiction fantasy novel if you're not grounded and you're lost in time and space. Yeah, you can read that if you want. Computers are just, right? Terry Davis's Temple OS is art, okay? Go watch Down the Rabbit Hole, Fred Newton's Down the Rabbit Hole episode on Temple OS, and understand that this is someone actually taking charge of their environment, and this is the state of the artist today. Not, alright? Okay. John goes on to recapitulate everything in through Kierkegaard. He goes and posits a new question for the group. Does art necessitate beauty to draw people in? And look at this. I've been talking for like 50 minutes now. I'm glad that's probably in real time. In fact, I'm probably about to equal the the running length of the whole. I just recapitulated the whole video by myself. Okay. Oh well. I've recapitulated 50 minutes of the video in video itself. So Eliot's disassociation of sensibility, as he says in his book, as his essay on the metaphysical poets, is precisely the distance between both propositional knowing and procedural knowing, and the other ways of knowing, which are better addressed through art, apparently, but actually art should... Well, anyway, lots more to talk about. I love to talk about it. Let me know what you think about this video. Comment down below. If you want to talk about how this can all be autodidactically run ahead of where the conversation is at right now, I'd like to kind of like demonstrate that. Like what's art of being is internet trolls as in the being mode and the having mode. I think would be a useful way to think about that, because we actually have to like look at reality. This is all practical stuff. This isn't just high level philosophy, or else you're never gonna escape the 1920s. Cool. Thanks. I hope this was. I hope somebody out there found this interesting. I'm sure most people will turn it off after 5 minutes, but hey, thanks for listening if you made it this far. Yeah, all the best. Take care.